Side 3. Mrs. Lunt, by Hugh Walpole. "Do you believe in ghosts?" I asked Runciman. I had to ask him this very platitudinous question, more because he was so difficult a man to spend an hour with, rather than for any other reason. You know his books, perhaps, or more probably you don't know them. The Running Man, The Elm Tree, and Crystal and Candlelight. He is one of those little men who are constant enough in this age of immense overproduction of books, men who publish every autumn their novel, who arouse by that publication in certain critics eager appreciation and praise, who have a small and faithful public, whose circulation is very small, who, when you meet them, have little to say, are often shy and nervous, pessimistic and remote from daily life. Such men do fine work, are made but little of in their own day, and perhaps 50 years after their death are rediscovered by some critic and become a sort of cult with a new generation. I asked Runciman that question because I had invited him to dinner at my flat and was now faced with a long evening filled with that most tiresome of conversations, talk that dies every 2 minutes and has to be revived with exertions. Being myself a critic, and having on many occasions praised Runciman's works, he was the more nervous and shy with me. Had I abused it, he would perhaps have had plenty to say. He was that kind of man. But my question was a lucky one. It roused him instantly. His long, bony body became full of a new energy. His eyes stared into a rich and exciting reminiscence. He spoke without a pause, and I took care not to interrupt him. He certainly told me one of the most astounding stories I've ever heard. Whether it was true or not, I cannot, of course, say. These ghost stories are nearly always at second or third hand. I had, at any rate, the good fortune to secure mine from the source. Moreover, Runciman was not a liar. He was too serious for that. He himself admitted that he was not sure at this distance of time as to whether the thing had gained as the years passed. However, here it is, as he told it.
It was some 15 years ago. I went down to Cornwall to stay with Robert Lunt. Do you remember his name? No, I suppose you do not. He wrote several novels, some of those half-and-half things that are not quite novels, not quite poems, rather mystical and picturesque and are the very devil to do well. Delamere's Return is a good example of the kind of thing. I'd reviewed somewhere his last book, and reviewed it favourably, and received from him a really touching letter showing that the man was thirsting for praise, and also, I fancied, for company. He lived in Cornwall on the sea-coast, and his wife had died 12 months before. He said he was quite alone there, and would I come and spend Christmas with him? He hoped I would not think this impertinent. He expected that I would be engaged already, but he could not resist the chance. Well, I wasn't engaged, far from it. If Lunt was lonely, so was I. If Lunt was a failure, so was I. I was touched, as I've said, by his letter, and I accepted his invitation. As I went down in the train to Penzance, I wondered what kind of a man he would be. I'd never seen any photographs of him. He was not the sort of author whose picture the newspapers publish. He must be, I fancied, about my own age, perhaps rather older. I know when we're lonely how some of us are forever imagining that a friend will somewhere turn up, that ideal friend who will understand all one's feelings, who will give one affection without being sentimental, who will take an interest in one's affairs without being impertinent. Yes, the sort of friend one never finds. I fancy that I became quite romantic about Lunt before I reached Penzance. I imagined him as spare and delicate and refined, with a sort of wistfulness and rather childish play of fancy. We both, so far, failed in our careers, but perhaps together we would do great things. When I arrived at Penzance, it was almost dark, and the snow, threatened all day by an overhanging sky, had begun gently and timorously to fall. He told me in his letter that a fly would be at the station to take me to his house. And there I found it, an old weather-beaten carriage with a funny old weather-beaten driver. At this distance of time, my imagination may have created many things, but I fancy that from the moment I was shut into that carriage, some dim suggestion of fear and apprehension attacked me. I fancy that I had some absurd impulse to get out of the thing and take the night train back to London again. An action that would have been very unlike me, as I'd always a sort of obstinate determination to carry through anything that I'd begun. In any case, I was uncomfortable in that carriage. It had, I remember, a nasty, musty smell of damp straw and stale eggs, and it seemed to confine me so closely as though it were determined that once I was in, I should never get out again. And then it was bitterly cold. It was that penetrating cold that seems to pierce your very brain, so that I could not think with any clearness, but only wish again and again that I hadn't come. Of course, I could see nothing, only feel the jolt over the uneven road. And once again, we seemed to fight our way through dark paths, because I could feel the overhanging branches of the trees knock against the cab. Well, I mustn't make more of it than the facts allow, and I mustn't see into it all the significance of the events that followed. I only know that as the drive proceeded, I became more and more miserable. Miserable with the cold of my body, the misgivings of my imagination, the general loneliness of my case. At last we stopped. The old scarecrow got slowly off his box, with many heavings and sighings, came to the cab door, and with great difficulty opened it. I got out and found that the snow was falling very heavily, and that the path was lightened with its soft, mysterious glow. Before me was a humped and ungainly shadow, the house that was to receive me. I could make nothing of it in that darkness, but only stood there shivering while the old man pulled at the doorbell with a sort of energy as if he were anxious to be rid of the whole job as quickly as possible. At last the door opened, and an old man, who might have been brother to the driver, poked out his head. The two old men talked together, and at last my bag was shouldered, and I was permitted to come in out of the piercing cold. Now, this, I know, is not imagination. I have never, at any period of my life, hated at first sight so vigorously any dwelling place into which I have entered as I did that house. There was nothing especially disagreeable about my first vision of the hall. It was a large, dark place lit by two dim lamps, cold and cheerless. But I got no particular impression of it because at once I was conducted out of it, led along a passage, and then introduced into a room which was, I saw at once, as warm and comfortable as the hall had been dark and dismal. I was, in fact, so eagerly pleased at the large and leaping fire that I moved towards it at once, not noting at the first moment the presence of my host. And when I did see him, I could not believe that it was he. I've told you the kind of man that I'd expected. But instead of the spare, sensitive artist, I found facing me a large, burly man, over 6 foot, I should fancy, as broad-shouldered as he was tall, giving evidence of great muscular strength, the lower part of his face hidden by a black pointed beard. But if I was astonished at the sight of him, I was doubly amazed when he spoke. His voice was thin and piping, like that of some old woman, and the little nervous gestures he made with his hands were even more feminine than his voice. But I had to allow perhaps for excitement, for excited he was. He came up to me, took my hand in both of his, and held it as though he would never let it go. In the evening, when we sat over our coffee, he apologized for this. I was so glad to see you, he said. I couldn't believe that you really would come. You're the first visitor of my own kind that I've had here for ever so long. I was ashamed indeed of asking you, but I had to snatch at the chance. It means so much to me. His eagerness, in fact, had something disturbing about it. There's something pathetic, too. He simply couldn't do too much for me. He led me through crumbling old passages, the boards creaking under us at every step, up some dark stairs. The walls hung, so far as I could see in the dim light, with faded yellow photographs of places, and showed me into my room with a deprecating, agitated gesture. I didn't like it any more than I liked the rest of the house. But that was not my host's fault. He'd done everything he possibly could for me. There was a large fire flaming in the open fireplace. There was a hot bottle, as he explained to me, in the big four-poster bed, and the old man who had opened the door to me was already taking my clothes out of my bag and putting them away. Lunt's nervousness was almost sentimental. He put both his hands on my shoulders and said, looking at me pleadingly, "Oh, if only you knew what it is for me to have you here. The talks we'll have. Well, I must leave you. You'll come down and join me, won't you, as soon as you can?" It was then, when I was left alone in my room, that I had my second impulse to flee. 4 candles in tall old silver candlesticks were burning brightly, and these, with a blazing fire, gave plenty of light. And yet the room was in some way dim, as though a faint smoke pervaded it. And I remember that I went to one of the old lattice windows and threw it open for a moment, as though I felt stifled. 2 things quickly made me close it. One was the intense cold, which, with a fluttering scamper of snow, blew into the room. The other was the quite deafening roar of the sea, which seemed to fling itself at my very face. I quickly shut the window, turned round, and saw an old woman standing just inside the door. Now, every story of this kind depends, for its interest, on its verisimilitude. Of course, to make my tale convincing, I should be able to prove to you that I saw the old woman. But I can't. I can only urge upon you my rather dreary reputation for probity. You know that I'm a teetotaler, and always have been, and the most important evidence of all, I was not expecting to see an old woman. And yet I hadn't the least doubt that it was an old woman I saw. You may talk about shadows, clothes hanging on the back of the door, and the rest of it. I don't know. I've no theories about this story. I'm not a spiritualist. I don't know that I believe in anything especially, except the beauty of beautiful things. We'll put it, if you like, that I fancy that I saw an old woman, and my fancy was so strong that I can give you a pretty detailed account of her appearance. She wore a black silk dress, and on her breast was a large, ugly gold brooch. She had black hair, brushed back from her forehead, and parted down the middle. She wore a collar of some white stuff around her throat. Her face was one of the most malignant and furtive that I've ever seen, very white in colour. She was shriveled enough now, but might once have been rather beautiful. She stood there quietly, her hands at her side. I thought that she was some kind of housekeeper. "Oh, I have everything I want, thank you," I said. What a splendid fire." I turned for a moment towards it, and when I looked back, she was gone. I thought nothing of this, of course, but drew up an old chair covered with green faded tapestry and thought that I would read a little before I went to join my host. The fact was that I was not very intent on joining him before I must. I didn't like him. I'd already made up my mind that I would find some excuse to return to London as soon as possible. I can't tell you why I didn't like him, except that I was myself very reserved, and had, like many Englishmen, a great distrust of demonstrations, especially from another man. I hadn't cared for the way in which he put his hands on my shoulders, and I felt perhaps that I wouldn't be able to live up to all his eager excitement about me. I sat in my chair, but I had not been reading for more than 2 minutes before I was conscious of a most unpleasant smell. Now, there are all sorts of smells, healthy and otherwise, but I think the nastiest is that chilly kind of odour that comes from bad sanitation and stuffy rooms combined. You meet it sometimes at country inns and decrepit town lodgings. This smell was so definite that I could almost locate it. It came from near the door. I got up, approached the door, and at once it was as though I were drawing near to somebody who, if you'll forgive the impoliteness, was not accustomed to taking too many baths. I drew back just as I might had an actual person been there. And then quite suddenly, the smell was gone. The room was fresh. And I saw, to my surprise, that one of the windows had opened and that snow was again blowing in. I closed it and went downstairs. The evening that followed was odd enough. My host was not in himself an unlikable man. He did his very utmost to please me. He had a fine culture and a wide knowledge of books and things. He became quite cheerful as the evening went on, gave me a good dinner in an old dining room hung with some admirable mezzotints. The old serving man looked after us, an old man with a long white beard like a goat. And oddly enough, it was from him that I first recaught my earlier apprehension. He just put the dessert on the table and arranged my plate in front of me, and I saw him give a start and look towards the door. My attention was attracted to this because his hand, as it touched the plate, suddenly trembled. My eyes followed, but I could see nothing. I thought that I detected once more that strange, unwholesome smell. I forgot this again when we were both seated in front of a splendid fire in the library. Lunt had a very fine collection of books, and it was delightful to him, as it is to every book collector, to have somebody who could really appreciate them. We stood looking at one book after another and talking eagerly about some of the minor early English novelists who were my special hobby. Bage, Godwin, Henry Mackenzie, Mrs. Shelley, Matt Lewis, and others. When once again he affected me most unpleasantly by putting his arm around my shoulder. I've all my life disliked intensely to be touched by certain people. It is one of those inexplicable things, and I disliked this so much that I abruptly drew away. Instantly, he was changed into a man of furious rage. I thought he was going to strike me. He stood there, quivering all over, the words pouring out of his mouth incoherently as though he were mad and did not know what he was saying. He accused me of insulting him, of abusing his hospitality, of throwing his kindness back into his face. And I can't tell you how strange it was to hear all this coming out in that shrill, piping voice as though it were from an agitated woman. And yet to see with one's eyes that big, muscular frame, those immense shoulders, and that dark, bearded face. I said nothing. I am physically a coward. I dislike any sort of quarrel. At last I brought out, "I'm very sorry. I didn't mean anything. Please forgive me." And then hurriedly turned to leave the room. And once he changed again. Now he was almost in tears. He implored me not to go. Said it was his wretched temper, but that he was so miserable and unhappy, and had for so long now been alone that he hardly knew what he was doing. He begged me to give him another chance, and if I would only listen to his story, I would perhaps be more patient with him. At once, so oddly is man constituted, I changed in my feelings towards him. I was very sorry for him. I saw that he was a man on the edge of his nerves, and that he really did need some help and sympathy, and would be quite distracted if he could not get it. I put my hand on his shoulder to quieten him and to show him that I bore no malice, and I felt that his great body was quivering from head to foot. We sat down again, and in an odd, rambling manner, he told me his story. The gist of it was that, rather to have some sort of companionship than from any impulse of passion, he had married, some 15 years before, the daughter of a neighbouring clergyman. They had had no very happy life together, and at the last, he told me quite frankly, he had hated her. She'd been mean, overbearing, and narrow-minded. It had been, he confessed, nothing but a relief to him when, just a year ago, she'd suddenly died from heart failure. He'd thought then that things would go better with him, but they had not. Nothing had gone right with him. He hadn't been able to work. Many of his friends had ceased to come to see him. He'd found it difficult even to get servants to stay with him. He was lonely. He slept badly. But that was why his temper was so on edge. He had no one in the house with him save the old man, who was fortunately an excellent cook, and a boy, the old man's grandson. "Oh, I thought," I said, that excellent meal tonight was cooked by your housekeeper." "My housekeeper," he answered. There's no woman in the house." "Oh, but one came to my room," I replied, "this evening. An old, ladylike-looking person in a black silk dress." "You were mistaken," he answered in the oddest voice. as though he were exerting all the strength he possessed to keep himself quiet and controlled. "I'm sure that I saw her," I answered. "There couldn't be any mistake." And I described her to him. "You were mistaken," he repeated again. "Don't you see that you must have been when I tell you there is no woman in the house?" I reassured him quickly, lest there should be another outbreak of rage. Then there followed the oddest kind of appeal. He begged me to stay with him for a few days. He implied, though he said nothing definitely, that he was in great trouble, that if only I would stay for a few days, all would be well, that if I ever in all my life had had a chance of doing a kind action, I had one now, that he couldn't expect me to stop in so dreary a place, but that he would never forget it if I did. He spoke in a voice of such urgent distress that I reassured him as I might a child, promising that I would stay, and shaking hands with him on it as though it were a kind of solemn oath between us. I'm sure that you would wish me to give you this incident as it occurred, and if the final catastrophe seems to come, as it were, accidentally, I can only say to you that that was how it happened. But the truth is that after that very strange episode between us, I had a very good night. I slept cosy and warm in my four-poster, with the murmur of the sea beyond my windows to rock my slumbers. Next morning was bright and cheerful, the sun sparkling down on the snow, and the snow sparkling back to the sun. I had a very pleasant morning, looking at Lunt's books, talking to him, and writing one or two letters. I must say that, after all, I liked the man. His appeal to me on the night before had touched me. So few people, you see, had ever appealed to me about anything. His nervousness was there, and the constant sense of apprehension, yet he seemed to be putting the best face on it, doing his utmost to set me at my ease in order to induce me to stay. I dare say, if I'd not been so busy about the books, I would not have been so happy. There was a strange, eerie silence about the house if one ever stopped to listen. And once, I remember, sitting at the old bureau writing a letter, I raised my head and looked up and caught Lunt watching as though he wondered whether I had heard or noticed anything. And so I listened too. And it seemed to me as though someone were on the other side of the library door with a hand raised to knock. I could have sworn that if I'd gone to the door and opened it suddenly, someone would have been there. However, I was cheerful enough, and after lunch, quite happy. Lunt asked me if I would like a walk, and I said I would. And we started out in the sunshine over the crunching snow towards the sea. I don't remember of what we talked. We seemed to be now quite at our ease with one another. We crossed the fields to a certain point, looked down at the sea, smooth now, like silk, and turned back. I remember that I was so cheerful that I seemed suddenly to take a happy view of all my prospects. I began to confide in Lunt, telling him of my little plans, of my hopes for the book that I was then writing, and even began rather timidly to suggest to him that perhaps we should do something together, that what we both needed was a friend of common taste with ourselves. I know that I was talking on, that we had crossed a little village street and were turning up the path towards the dark avenue of trees that led to his house, when suddenly the change came. What I first noticed was that he was not listening to me. His gaze was fixed beyond me, into the very heart of the black clump of trees that fringed the silver landscape. I looked too, and my heart bounded. There was, standing just in front of the trees, as though she were waiting for us, the old woman whom I'd seen in my room the night before. I stopped. "Why, there she is," I said. "That's the old woman of whom I was speaking, the old woman who came to my room." He caught my shoulder with his hand. "There's nothing there," he said. "Don't you see that shadow? What's the matter with you? Can't you see there's nothing?" I stepped forward, and there was nothing. And I wouldn't to this day be able to tell you whether it was hallucination or not. I can only say that from that moment, the afternoon appeared to become dark. As we entered the avenue of trees, silently, and hurrying as though someone were behind us, the dusk seemed to have fallen so that I could scarcely see my way. We reached the house, breathless. He hastened into his study as though I were not with him, but I followed, and closing the door behind me, said with all the force I had at command, "Now, what is this? What is it that's troubling you? You must tell me. How can I help you if you don't?" And he replied, in so strange a voice that it was as if he had gone out of his mind. "I tell you there is nothing. Can't you believe me when I tell you there's nothing at all? I'm quite all right. Oh, my God! Oh, my God, don't leave me! Oh, this is the very day, the very night," she said. "But I did nothing, I tell you, I did nothing. It's only her malice." He broke off. He still held my arm with his hand. He made strange movements, wiping his forehead as though it were damp with sweat. I saw that he was truly not far from madness, and I began myself to have a sudden terror of this house, of this great trembling man, and something more that was worse than they. But I pitied him. How could you or any man have helped him? I made him sit down in the armchair beside the fire, which had now dwindled to a few glimmering red coals. I let him hold me close to him with his arm and clutch my hand with his, and I repeated, as quietly as I might, "Tell me, don't be afraid, whatever it is that you have done. Tell me what danger it is that you fear, and then we can face it together." "Fear? Fear?" he repeated. And then, with a mighty effort, which I could not but admire, he summoned all his control. "I'm off my head," he said, "with loneliness and depression. My wife died a year ago on this very night. We hated one another. I couldn't be sorry when she died, and she knew it. When that last heart attack came on, between her gasps, she told me that she would return. And I've always dreaded this night. That's partly why I asked you to come, to have anyone here, anybody, and you've been very kind. More kind than I had any right to expect. You must think me insane going on like this, but see me through tonight, and we'll have splendid times together. Don't desert me now of all times." I promised that I wouldn't. I soothed him as best I could. We sat there through the gathering dark. We neither of us moved. The fire died out, and the room was lit with a strange dim glow that came from the snowy landscape beyond the uncurtained windows. Ridiculous, perhaps, as I look back at it. We sat there, I in a chair close to his, hand in hand like a couple of lovers. But in real truth, two men terrified, fearful of what was coming, and unable to do anything to meet it. I think that was perhaps the strangest part of it, a sort of paralysis that crept over me. What would you or anyone else have done? Summoned the old man, gone down to the village inn, fetched the local doctor? I could do nothing but see the snow shine move like trembling water about the furniture, and hear through the urgent silence the faint hoot of an owl from the trees in the wood. Oddly enough, I can remember nothing, try as I may, between that strange vigil and the moment when I myself, wakened out of a brief sleep, sat up in bed to see Lunt standing inside my room holding a candle. He was wearing a nightshirt and looked huge in the candlelight, his black beard falling intensely dark on the white stuff of his shirt. He came very quietly towards my bed, the candle throwing flickering shadows about the room. When he spoke, it was in a low voice, subdued, almost a whisper. "Would you come?" he asked. "Only for half an hour. Just for half an hour," he repeated, staring at me as though he didn't know me. "I'm unhappy without somebody. Very unhappy." Then he looked over his shoulder, held the candle high above his head, and stared piercingly at every part of the room. I could see that something had happened to him, that he had taken another step into the country of fear, a step that had withdrawn him from me and from every other human being. He whispered, "When you come, tread softly. I don't want anyone to hear us." I did what I could. I got out of bed, put on my dressing gown and slippers, and tried to persuade him to stay with me. The fire was almost dead, but I told him that we would build it up again, and that we would sit there and wait for the morning. But no, he repeated again and again, "It's better in my own room. We're safer there." "Safe from what?" I asked him, making him look at me. "Lunt, wake up. You're as though you were asleep. There's nothing to fear. We've nobody but ourselves. Stay here and let us talk and have done with this nonsense." But he wouldn't answer. only drew me forward down the dark passage and then turned into his room, beckoning me to follow. He got into bed and sat bunched up there, his hands holding his knees, staring at the door, and every once and again shivering with a little tremor. The only light in the room was that from the candle, and the only sound was the purring whisper of the sea. It seemed to make little difference to him that I was there. He didn't look at me, only at the door, and when I spoke to him he didn't answer me nor seem to hear what I said. I sat beside the bed, and to break the silence, talked on about anything, about nothing, and was dropping off, I think, into a confused doze, when I heard his voice breaking across mine. Very clearly and distinctly he said, "If I killed her, she deserved it. She was never a good wife to me, not from the first. She shouldn't have irritated me as she did. She knew what my temper was. She had a worse one than mine, though. She can't touch me. I'm as strong as she is." And it was then, as clearly as I can now remember, that his voice suddenly sank into a sort of gentle whisper, as though he was almost glad that his fears had been confirmed. He whispered, "She's there?" I cannot possibly tell you how that whisper seemed to let fear loose like water through my body. I could see nothing, but Lunt suddenly screamed, with a shrill cry like a tortured animal in agony, "Keep her off me! Keep her away from me! Keep her off! Keep her off!" He caught me, his hands digging into my shoulders. Then, with an awful effect of constricted muscles, as though rigor had caught and held him, his arms slowly fell away. He slipped back onto the bed as though someone were pushing him. His hands fell against the sheet, his whole body jerked with a convulsive effort, and then he rolled over. I saw nothing. Only quite distinctly in my nostrils was the same fetid odour that I had known on the preceding evening. I rushed to the door, opened it, shouted down the long passage again and again, and soon the old man came running. I sent him for the doctor, and then could not return to the room, but stood there listening, hearing nothing save the whisper of the sea, the loud ticking of the hall clock. I flung open the window at the end of the passage. The sea rushed in with its precipitant roar. Some bells chimed the hour. Then, at last, beating into myself more courage, I turned back towards the room.
Well, I asked as Runciman paused. He was dead, of course.
Dead, the doctor afterwards said, of heart failure.
Well?
That's all. I don't know whether you can even call it a ghost story. My idea of the old woman may have been all hallucination. I don't even know whether his wife was like that when she was alive. She may have been large and fat. The only thing is that on Lunt's body, there were marks, on his neck especially, some on his chest, as of fingers pressing in, scratches and dull blue marks. He may, in his terror, have caught at his own throat.
Yes?
Anyway, I don't like Cornwall. Beastly county. Queer things happen there. Something in the air.
So I've heard. And now have a drink. We both will.
The Open Window by Saki. "My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nuttall," said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. "In the meantime, you must try and put up with me." Frampton Nuttall endeavoured to say the correct something which should duly flatter the niece of the moment without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits on a succession of total strangers would do much towards helping the nerve cure which he was supposed to be undergoing. "I know how it will be," his sister had said when he was preparing to migrate to this rural retreat. "You will bury yourself down there and not speak to a living soul, and your nerves will be worse than ever from moping. I shall just give you letters of introduction to all the people I know there. Some of them, as far as I can remember, were quite nice." Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. "Do you know many of the people round here?" asked the niece, when she judged that they had had sufficient silent communion. "Hardly a soul," said Frampton. "My sister was staying here, at the rectory, you know, some 4 years ago, and she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here." He made the last statement in a tone of distinct regret. "Then you know practically nothing about my aunt," pursued the self-possessed young lady. "Only her name and address," admitted the caller. He was wondering whether Mrs. Sappleton was in the married or widowed state. An indefinable something about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. "Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago," said the child. "That would be since your sister's time." "Her tragedy?" asked Frampton. Somehow in this restful country spot, tragedies seemed out of place. "You may wonder why we keep that window open on an October afternoon," said the niece, indicating a large French window that opened onto a lawn. "It is quite warm for the time of the year," said Frampton. "But has that window got anything to do with the tragedy?" "Out through that window, 3 years ago, to a day, her husband and her 2 young brothers went off for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favourite snipe shooting ground, they were all 3 engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, you know, and places that were safe in other years gave way suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it." Here the child's voice lost its self-possessed note and became falteringly human. "Poor aunt always thinks they will come back some day. They and the little brown spaniel that was lost with them, and walk in at that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every evening until it is quite dusk. Poor dear aunt, she's often told me how they went out, her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing 'Bertie, why do you bound?' as he always did, to tease her because she said it got on her nerves. Do you know, sometimes on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling that they will all walk in through that window." She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late in making her appearance. "I hope Vera has been amusing you," she said. "She has been very interesting," said Frampton. "I hope you don't mind the open window," said Mrs. Sappleton briskly. "My husband and brothers will be home directly from shooting, and they always come in this way. They've been out for snipe in the marshes today, so they'll make a fine mess over my poor carpets. So like you men folks, isn't it?" She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting and the scarcity of birds and the prospects for duck in the winter. To Frampton it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but only partially successful effort to turn the talk on to a less ghastly topic. He was conscious that his hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window and the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary. "The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest, an absence of mental excitement, and avoidance of anything in the nature of violent physical exercise," announced Frampton, who laboured under the tolerably widespread delusion that total strangers and chance acquaintances are hungry for the least detail of one's ailments and infirmities, their cause and cure. "On the matter of diet, they are not so much in agreement," he continued. "No?" said Mrs. Sappleton, in a voice which only replaced a yawn at the last moment. Then she suddenly brightened into alert attention, but not to what Frampton was saying. "Here they are at last!" she cried. "Just in time for tea. And don't they look as if they were muddy up to the eyes?" Frampton shivered slightly and turned towards the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. The child was staring out through the open window with dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung round in his seat and looked in the same direction. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn towards the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulders. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk, "I said, Bertie, why do you bound?" Frampton grabbed wildly at his stick and hat. The hall door, the gravel drive, and the front gate were dimly noted stages in his headlong retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had run into the hedge to avoid imminent collision. "Here we are, my dear," said the bearer of the white mackintosh, coming in through the window. "Fairly muddy, but most of it's dry. Who is that who bolted out as we came up?" "A most extraordinary man, a Mr. Nuttall," said Mrs. Sappleton. "Could only talk about his illness, and dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he had seen a ghost." "I expect it was the spaniel," said the niece calmly. "He told me he had a horror of dogs. He was once hunted into a cemetery somewhere on the banks of the Ganges by a pack of pariah dogs, and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave, with the creatures snarling and grinning and foaming just above him. Enough to make anyone lose their nerve." Romance at short notice was her speciality. End of side 3.